Have you ever witnessed a million-pound wedding collapse completely in just 60 seconds? The video of that event reached over 5 million views in just 24 hours, and the world was stunned to see a perfect empire crumble right during the reception. 8 hours after that footage exploded on social media, a woman called and screamed in a madness so out of control. The man on the other end just listened silently to her rapid breathing, feeling the collapse of a play she had painstakingly staged for 3 decades. Alistair Banks, a 58-year-old architect, knew better than anyone that sometimes a person's greatest strength is not in owning everything, but in daring to walk out of glamorous lies to find freedom. This is not just a story about betrayal, but the journey of an underestimated man who quietly turned his fate around from a distance of 4,000 miles. The engine of the luxury car hummed low in the thick London rain as Alistair Banks drove toward the Richmond area. The £5 million villa stood proudly by the River Thames, appearing with the cold beauty of marble and polished reinforced glass. Inside that house, Vivienne Thorne had turned every corner into a living art exhibition. As a leading style consultant for the London elite, Vivienne had a natural talent for making spaces perfect and making people feel small. For 30 years, Alistair had lived in this marriage like an uninvited guest in his own home. He had watched the living room be redecorated 3 times in 2 years, just because the old colors no longer reflected the status Vivienne desired. Every time he tried to express an opinion, she would skillfully brush it aside with a mocking smile, making him feel only 6 inches tall among the aristocratic guests. The real turning point came on the 23rd of October. It was a typical gray English afternoon. Alistair was standing in the modern kitchen when his chest tightened as if a stone were pressing against his ribs. Meanwhile, Vivienne was busy directing painters to change the accent wall's tone, explaining that the old gray was too cheap and the new gray was truly sophisticated. As Alistair collapsed and his breath became ragged, Vivienne did not even turn back to look. She said she could not leave because the painters needed close supervision. Alistair had to drive himself to the emergency room in agonizing pain. At the hospital, the cardiologist used the word pressure exactly 14 times in his report. Lying on the pure white bed, Alistair looked at the ceiling and realized a devastating truth. He could die right in that villa, and Vivienne would not even know until his body blocked the entrance to her wardrobe. In everyone's eyes, Alistair Banks was just a quiet husband, a washed-up architect who always obeyed his powerful wife. But deep inside, the brain of a genius systems designer was still operating sharply. Leaving the hospital on that sunny October afternoon, Alistair made a decision no one could have expected. He signed the discharge papers with hands steadier than ever. On the way home, he looked at London for one last time and knew he had already left, even though his body was still in the car. That night, when Vivienne knocked on the office door to ask if he was going to bed, Alistair simply replied that he was busy. He lay on the leather sofa, feeling his heart beat steadily and wondering if he wanted to continue existing or truly live. That mild heart attack was not an end, but a massive wake-up call. Alistair began to open his laptop and plan the greatest escape of his life. A plan built as meticulously as a technical drawing with zero margin for error, where he would leave all the fake glamour and massive debts to the woman who had despised him for 30 years. Alistair Banks's journey to find himself had only just begun from the moment he closed the doors of the Richmond villa and stepped into the darkness of dawn. Alistair Banks spent exactly 6 months executing the most important drawing of his life, not a blueprint for a London skyscraper, but a design for absolute freedom. From the moment he stepped out of the hospital, he began to operate like a precise and cold machine. In Vivienne's world, Alistair was merely a fading husband who handled the bills, but she had no idea that behind that submissive exterior was an intellect that had once built and sold a software company for £8.5 million. After paying all taxes, Alistair owned £4.2 million in cash, a figure sufficient for him to live regally anywhere. Yet he chose a much more sophisticated path. He quietly designed a financial labyrinth where every exit led to protection for those he loved and punishment for those who had looked down on him. First, Alistair established an irrevocable family trust worth £2.1 million and named his daughter, Sophie, as the sole beneficiary. Sophie, 27, currently a forensic accountant in London with sharp eyes, had long ago seen through her mother's superficial facade years before. During a late evening at a small pub near London Bridge, Alistair handed his daughter a thick file. He looked into Sophie's eyes and saw a quiet understanding that required no words. "You should have done this a long time ago, Dad," Sophie whispered while squeezing his hand. She knew that this money would be safe from any interference by Vivienne. In contrast, Julian, the 24-year-old son working as a banker at Canary Wharf, was completely captivated by his mother's aura. Julian viewed his father's silence as a sign of failure and frequently repeated Vivienne's bitter words that Alistair was an emotionless and distant man. Alistair did not explain. He accepted the role of the failure to prepare for a final blow. The villa in Richmond was the most complex piece in this plan. The house had no mortgage and was worth approximately £1.3 million. Alistair proceeded to refinance and withdrew £890,000 in cash. One evening, while Vivienne was busy trying on new silk dresses, he handed her the loan documents among the usual administrative papers. Vivienne signed without looking for a single second, as she always considered financial management to be Alistair's inferior duty while she was busy shining in public. She had no idea that she had just signed a massive debt commitment. Alistair left Vivienne the house, the luxury cars, and all the expensive furniture. But it came with an £890,000 mortgage that she would never be able to afford once his financial support was gone. While Vivienne was preoccupied with planning lavish dinner parties, Alistair secretly prepared for life in Florence. He set aside £850,000 into international investment accounts, ensuring a passive income of around £55,000 per year. With the cost of living in Italy at about £3,500 per month, the numbers aligned perfectly. Alistair learned Italian through phone apps every night after Vivienne had fallen fast asleep, feeling the excitement of an architect watching his project take shape from the very first bricks. He felt no guilt. Bitterness had been replaced by a frighteningly calm composure. He had spent 30 years making himself small so that Vivienne could shine brighter, and now his body had given its final warning: he would never betray himself again. The 15th of January arrived like any other ordinary Tuesday in the gray English weather. Alistair woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning, while fog still covered the River Thames. He dressed in simple clothes and packed 30 years of his life into just 2 leather suitcases. There were no farewells, no final arguments. He placed the divorce papers and the house keys on the kitchen table right under the porcelain cup Vivienne loved most, accompanied by a brief note stating that everything was now hers. As the Uber rolled away from Richmond at 5:30 in the morning, Alistair looked back at the house one last time through the window. He was no longer a deceived architect or a despised father. He was a free man flying across the ocean to start a new chapter where there was no room for lies. While Vivienne was still immersed in the sleep of pride, Alistair Banks had truly vanished, leaving behind a paper empire that was beginning to burn from its rotten foundations. Mornings in Florence began with the tolling of church bells and the rich scent of espresso rising from Pedro's shop right below the apartment. 5 months since leaving London, Alistair Banks had built a rhythm of life for himself that he no longer recognized in the most positive way. There were no more jarring alarms, no more glamorous performances for the elite, and most importantly, no one demanding that he become small to make room for another's selfishness. His apartment was located in the Oltrarno district, with terracotta bricks and a balcony looking directly over the River Arno, where boats drifted silently as if they had all the time in the world. Every morning, Alistair went swimming at a local pool before walking to Pedro's for breakfast. Pedro was a man in his 60s, patient with Alistair's stilted Italian, and had never asked about his past. That was what Alistair loved most about Florence. No one cared who you used to be, or how many millions of pounds you held in your account. He began to learn painting, from clumsy sketches until the hands that once designed complex software systems began to find a rhythm on the canvas. Alistair's health had changed miraculously. His blood pressure dropped to 118/72. He slept a full 8 hours every night and lost 15 pounds without even trying. The 850,000 pounds was managed prudently, bringing in a stable income that allowed him to enjoy genuine contentment. Sophie called him every Sunday, speaking of her successes in London. She had been promoted twice and seemed to be enjoying the freedom of no longer having to deal with her mother's manipulation. In contrast, Julian had not called even once. Sophie said that Julian needed time for his anger to subside, but Alistair understood that his son was imprisoned in an illusory world that Vivienne had woven. On a Tuesday afternoon, while Alistair was sketching ancient rooftops at Pedro's, his phone vibrated. It was a direct message on social media from Scott Turner, a friend from university whom he had lost contact with for 20 years. The message was brief, but carried an incredible weight. Scott said that Vivienne was preparing to marry next month to a man named Preston Montgomery, a famous restaurant chain owner in London. The wedding would be held at a lavish estate in the English countryside. Alistair read the message twice, then put the phone down and took a sip of espresso. He felt nothing but pure curiosity, much like how one is curious about the ending of a bad film that they had abandoned halfway through. However, as he began to search for the name Preston Montgomery on his computer, the instincts of a CEO who had analyzed thousands of deals began to resurface. Preston Montgomery's social media profile was filled with photos of a luxurious life and 300,000 followers. Expensive cars, bespoke suits, and images of a glamorous Vivienne Thorne on his arm at charity events. Preston claimed to own 3 high-end restaurants, opened within just 18 months. Alistair narrowed his eyes at the numbers. Such rapid expansion required a massive amount of capital or extremely dangerous financial leverage. He accessed public business records in the United Kingdom and saw a reality completely different from the online glamour. Credit limits were maxed out with total debts reaching £4.1 million. Many food and wine suppliers had filed lawsuits for unpaid invoices. Preston Montgomery was not a successful businessman, but a man standing on the brink of bankruptcy, trying to use new investor money to fill the massive holes of the old. But what truly made Alistair's heart tighten was seeing Julian, his son, appearing in Preston's photos with captions praising him as a brother and an ideal role model. His son was unwittingly endorsing a financial fraudster right before that person's foundations collapsed completely. Alistair stood up and looked out at the River Arno as the sunset dyed the water gold. He did not want Vivienne to suffer. He had moved past that feeling long ago. But he could not stand by and watch his son be dragged into the abyss along with Preston's collapse. Justice was not revenge, but when the truth finally found its voice. Alistair Banks knew that he could not continue to be silent while a disaster was being prepared under the name of a perfect wedding. Preston Montgomery was not merely a liar. He was a life destroyer, hidden behind the smile of a London high society gentleman. 2 days after the message from Scott, Alistair remained diligently immersed in figures just as he used to dissect an outdated software system to find fatal vulnerabilities. From the balcony of his Florence apartment, looking out over the poetic River Arno, Alistair was entering a silent information war that no one in London could have expected. With 15 years of running a technology business, he understood that numbers never lie. Only humans attempt to bend them to their will. Records at the United Kingdom's Companies House showed that Preston operated 3 limited companies. Montgomery Prime opened in 2022, claiming annual revenue of £4.2 million. This was followed by the Preston House at £3.8 million and finally Bella Vista at £4 million. The total was £12 million, an extremely impressive figure for a business that had only been operating for 18 months. But as Alistair dug deep into asset and debt registrations, he found a completely different picture. Business credit limits at First National Bank had reached a maximum of £2.3 million. Another equipment loan worth £1.8 million had also been completely exhausted. More disturbingly, London court records showed unresolved complaints from food suppliers amounting to £180,000 and wine suppliers suing for £95,000. This was not a delay in negotiations, but a sign of depleted cash flow. Alistair sat back in his chair, watching tourists pass by Pedro's shop with radiant smiles. Preston Montgomery was building a castle on sand by taking money from new investors to pay off old debts, keeping the appearance of success from collapsing before finding his next prey. And Vivienne was that perfect prey, with her extensive network within the London aristocracy. Alistair's phone vibrated. It was Sophie calling from the financial inspector's office in London. "Dad, I ran Preston's corporate structure through forensic accounting software, and the results are worse than we thought," Sophie said, her voice dropping with worry. He reported £12 million in revenue to investors, but in reality only brought in about 6 or 7 million. The rest was just phantom figures created to deceive trust. Currently, at least 15 families have poured £2.7 million into it. Some have even remortgaged their second homes to invest in Preston's empire. This was no longer a business failure. It was a systematic financial crime. But what made Alistair's heart tighten was the next piece of information from his daughter. Sophie revealed that Julian was not just a guest, but was standing as the best man for Preston. As a specialist at a conservative bank like Canary Wharf, Julian's appearance in the commemorative photos of a transnational financial fraud would be the end of his career and reputation. Julian was being blinded by pride and Preston's flattery to the point of not realizing that he himself was standing next to a time bomb set to explode right on his mother's big day. "I tried to warn Julian, but he called me bitter," Alistair said, his voice husky with the pain and helplessness of a father pushed to the sidelines. Sophie sighed and replied that Julian was living in the illusion of his mother's perfect family, and he needed a real shock to wake up. After hanging up, Alistair stood up and looked towards the horizon, where London was sinking into the sunset of lies. He could not stop this wedding and could not force Julian to see the truth if he was not ready to face it. But Alistair Banks was not the kind of man who would stand by and watch his son fall into the abyss. He would ensure that the truth had the loudest voice at the exact moment when Preston Montgomery's mask was most carefully polished. Alistair began searching for a name in his contacts that he had not called for 10 years. An old friend with the ability to expose the naked truth amidst the vibrant crowd of the British elite. Alistair Banks did not sit still to watch the tragedy happen. He began to arrange his pieces with the composure of an architect, placing the final structural concrete blocks for a great work. From the balcony in Florence overlooking the glittering River Arno, Alistair picked up the phone to call a name he had kept private in his contacts for 10 years. Patrick Donovan, a leading event specialist in London, who once owed Alistair a great favor when he helped him restructure a massive debt in the past. Alistair explained that he did not need crude sabotage. He only needed the truth to have the most distinguished place in the ceremony. Patrick listened in silence, then laughed softly and promised that he knew exactly who had enough weight to make a whole room full of conceited people hold their breath. The person chosen was Sir William, a 72-year-old retired High Court judge with a dignified appearance and a voice full of the authority of the law. Sir William was the kind of person whom juries always trusted implicitly at first sight. Patrick had cleverly placed Sir William's name on the guest list of the wedding service unit at the Cotswolds estate, on the grounds that he was a longtime family friend who happened to be in the area. Alistair sent all the legal files, asset freezes, and evidence of Preston Montgomery's fraud to Sir William. The old judge's task was not to accuse, but to raise questions about the foundations of success, a topic perfectly suited for a wedding toast. 3 days before the wedding, Alistair's phone rang in the warm evening of Florence. It was Julian, calling his father for the first time since January. Julian's voice was full of smugness and distance, like a stranger announcing an administrative decision. Julian said he would stand as the best man for Preston and called it a great honor because Preston represented everything Alistair did not have: vision, confidence, and brilliant success. Alistair gripped the balcony railing, feeling the pain tighten in his chest, not because of a heart attack, but because of his son's blindness. He tried to offer one last warning, reminding Julian to double-check the data sources and never place trust in glamorous appearances without a solid foundation. Julian responded with fierce defensiveness, claiming Alistair was only trying to destroy his mother's happiness out of the bitterness of a loser. He said that Preston was a solid man who had built a real empire before hanging up bluntly. Alistair stood silently in the Florence night, watching the boats pass on the River Arno. He felt a mixture of guilt and determination. Was this protecting his son or a punishment for Vivienne? The most honest answer was both, but above all, it was the execution of justice for 15 families who were about to lose £2.7 million and hundreds of employees about to lose their jobs when Preston's bubble burst. While Vivienne and Preston were rehearsing their vows in luxury in the English countryside, 4,000 miles away, Alistair Banks was mentally preparing for a storm that he himself had created. Sophie texted an update that Sir William had arrived at the wedding venue and had completely gained Preston's trust thanks to his elegant appearance and intellect. Preston was busy shining among the crowd and had no idea that a sentence for his lies had been prepared, ready to be announced before 200 elite guests. Alistair messaged his daughter back a single line, stating that the truth was not something one could retreat from, and he asked her to take care of Julian after everything collapsed. That night, Alistair did not sleep. He walked through the narrow streets of the Oltrarno district, feeling that freedom was finally near, but its price would be the shattering of a kingdom built on lies for so long. The 17th of July, 2024, was a radiant sunset afternoon in the English countryside. The estate in the Cotswolds appeared like a dream with 200 elite guests wearing their most splendid outfits. Everything was perfect, from the ivory silk ribbons to the melodic sound of violins in the wind. 4,000 miles away in Florence, Alistair Banks sat alone on his balcony looking at the River Arno, which had sunk into darkness. He did not watch the ceremony live, but every heartbeat of that event was conveyed by Sophie through brief text messages. At 6:14 p.m. UK time, the reception officially began, and Vivienne Thorne's world began to shake from cracks she did not even know existed. First was Julian's speech. The young man stood before the microphone with pride and deep emotion. Julian called Preston Montgomery a genius with extraordinary vision and the one who had shown him what true success looked like. Julian declared that in less than 18 months, Preston had built an empire, and this was the role model he aspired to become. Vivienne sat there smiling proudly, tears rolling down her carefully made-up cheeks, while Preston nodded with complete satisfaction. Alistair read his daughter's descriptions and felt his heart tighten at his son's innocence. Julian was publicly endorsing a fraudster right in front of London's elite, without knowing that he was tying a noose around his own career. Right then, Sir William stood up. With silver hair and a perfectly tailored gray suit, the retired judge stepped toward the microphone with an undeniable authority. The whole room fell silent naturally in his presence. Sir William began with a warm and calm voice, speaking about the importance of foundations in architecture and in life itself. He praised the beauty of the ceremony and the lightning expansion of the Montgomery restaurant chain. But then, the pace of his storytelling shifted abruptly. Sir William began to ask questions about how a business could achieve such meteoric growth without traditional financial sources. His voice rang out clearly across the banquet hall as he mentioned public court records regarding asset freezes and overdue debts amounting to millions of pounds. He mentioned 15 families who had invested £2.7 million into an illusory dream and a fraud lawsuit awaiting Preston next month. The entire room fell into a state of total freezing. The clinking of porcelain and the whispering died down, replaced instead by the light from hundreds of phone screens as guests began to search for information online. The truth began to flood the space like an unstoppable tide. Preston's face turned from flushed with wine to deathly pale with horror, while Vivienne stood frozen in place with wide, lifeless eyes. As Sir William raised his glass to the truth finally being exposed, chaos erupted. Guests began to leave in anger and contempt. Vivienne fled from the banquet hall, the sound of her high heels striking the stone floor, sounding like the collapse of a crystal kingdom. Alistair received a call from Vivienne at 12:22 a.m. Florence time. Her voice no longer had its usual aristocratic air, but was only hoarse screams and frantic accusations that he had destroyed her life. Alistair listened silently until she ran out of words. Then he only said gently that the truth was not something one could buy with money or cover up with layers of luxury paint. He put the phone down and looked out at the calm waters of the River Arno. 4,000 miles could not stop the feeling of relief spreading through his every vein. Justice had been executed, not through violence or malicious revenge, but by the power of naked truths brought to light at the most perfect moment. Alistair did not feel joy at Vivienne's suffering, but he felt free. He had protected Sophie, and, more importantly, he had given Julian a painful but necessary lesson to save his future. An old chapter of Alistair Banks' life had ended in the ruin of a £1 million wedding, but a truly solid new life had just officially begun from the very ashes of lies. 18 months have passed since that fateful afternoon in the English countryside, where a kingdom of lies collapsed in an instant. Alistair Banks still sits on his familiar balcony in Florence, watching the River Arno drift lazily under the golden Tuscan sun. The river is the same. The city is the same, but the lives of everyone involved have taken completely different directions. Preston Montgomery, the man who once claimed to be London's restaurant empire, was sentenced to 12 years in prison for financial fraud and money laundering after a 4-week trial in early 2025. All of his assets were liquidated, and the poor investors recovered only 31 pence for every pound they had put in. He is currently serving his sentence in a high-security prison, where bespoke suits have been replaced by the drab gray uniform of an inmate. Vivienne Thorne, the woman who once considered appearance to be everything, has had to face a reality harsher than death. The villa in Richmond was seized by the bank to pay for the massive mortgage debts that Alistair had cleverly left behind. After clearing all debts and legal fees, Vivienne was left with a pittance insufficient to maintain her former lavish lifestyle. She was forced to declare bankruptcy at the end of 2024 and currently lives in a tiny rented flat in a remote town, working as a sales assistant for £18 an hour. Her aristocratic social network vanished as soon as the video of the disastrous wedding went viral. Vivienne called Julian to ask for money, but her son refused because he, too, was struggling to rebuild his life from the ashes of a damaged reputation. Julian underwent a rigorous audit at the bank where he worked. Although he was cleared of any wrongdoing, his prestige was severely affected, leading to his transfer to a less significant department. However, it was that very collapse that helped Julian wake up. He began attending psychotherapy sessions to learn how to identify manipulation and build healthy personal boundaries. This past January, Julian came to Florence to visit his father. The two of them spent a whole week walking along the banks of the River Arno, and for the first time in 30 years, Julian truly listened to his father's thoughts. He met Nicole, a sincere and simple nurse who was completely different from the girls he used to date. Julian called Alistair to ask for his opinion on proposing and asked if he could help them design a simple wedding in Italy. Alistair smiled and agreed immediately. As for Alistair, his health has recovered miraculously. His blood pressure remains at 115/70, and he has not felt any chest pain for the past 18 months. He spends his time painting, learning Italian, and enjoying the freedom that cost him a lifetime to achieve. Alistair no longer feels bitterness toward Vivienne. He only feels a quiet indifference. He has learned that being alone does not mean being lonely, but rather a sense of completeness when you are finally allowed to be yourself. Justice in Alistair's eyes is not a hateful revenge, but simply when the truth is finally allowed to speak, and each person receives exactly what they have worked hard to sow. The truth is like a solid foundation of a building. If you build your life on lies, sooner or later it will collapse when the storm arrives. I hope Alistair Banks' story has brought you a valuable lesson about having the courage to choose yourself when everything around you is trying to wear you down. If these experiences have touched your heart, Please leave a comment below to share your thoughts. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next stories about the expensive lessons that life has taught us. Thank you very much for listening until these final seconds. I wish you always find the strength to live a true and peaceful life. See you in the upcoming stories.